Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon program. When I realized that I was going to be the middle presenter, I sort of felt like the middle child. The first child gets the best, which is obviously Fred, and then Marilyn gets the end, so I'm stuck in the middle. And what I'd like to do is to begin with some levity. You know, I like to start with maybe a little bit of lightness, since it's not a very light subject. So I have from my repertoire two jokes, one from the Eastern world and one from the Western world. And I'll start with the Eastern world. If we can set the tone and the setting, it's in a meditation hall, and there's a Buddhist congregation. And the Dharma teacher is teaching about death and dying. And what he says in the very beginning of the talk is that everyone in the congregation is going to die. And when he says that, someone in the back, sitting where Gary's sitting, starts to laugh really out loud, and they start to pump their fist. I got carried away. And it's rather disturbing. So the Dharma teacher okay, I got into character. So the Dharma teacher, is a little disturbed by it, and he says, "Excuse me, but why are you laughing and pumping your fist?" So the guy stands up and he says, "Because I'm not a member of this congregation." And then he says, "Furthermore, I'm not Buddhist." Okay, so now we're going to go to the Western joke. So the Western joke has to do with Woody Allen, whom I find to be very, very entertaining. And they're interviewing Woody Allen, and they say to him, "Do you fear death?" And you know how neurotic Woody Allen is, and he goes, "No, I have absolutely no fear of death. I just don't want to be around when it happens." Okay, so now that we've settled down, we're going to start with the talk, and we'll get into some interesting things. Let me see a raise of hands. How many people have a Buddhist practice? Okay, thank you. And how many people are familiar with the term ignorance? How many people are familiar with the Buddhist version of ignorance? Okay, because for those who hear the term ignorance, it's different in the Buddhist culture than it is in the Western culture. In the Buddhist culture, ignorance has nothing to do with your level of intellect or your understanding. It has to do with a fundamental distortion of reality. You don't see things the way they are. You see things the way you've created them and interpreted them in your mind. And we live our lives quite often in ignorance. We don't see what's really there. We see what we've concluded, interpreted, and decided should be there. And that's ignorance. And much of the practice of Buddhism is to clarify that distinction between what reality is versus what we think it is because we want it to be that way. And so much of what we talk about, if you remember that context of ignorance, you'll see many things unfold because of ignorance. And it's a very core teaching in Buddhism. So I just wanted to share that. Fred talked about the three messengers, which is a very famous reference in Buddhism. The messenger of sickness, old age, and death. And that was what the Buddha, who before he was a Buddha, was Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince in northern, it was in what we call now Nepal. But they had this very interesting effect because, as Fred said, the king, his father, was creating this idyllic world for him in the palace, and he never saw anything but a Hollywood movie of everything great. So when he was outside the palace walls and he saw these three messengers, he also saw a fourth messenger. And the fourth messenger was an ascetic, a yogi, who had absolutely nothing, no possessions. But strangely enough, he was happy. And that had an effect on him because the Buddha-to-be, Siddhartha, was curious why this man with nothing, how could that possibly, be someone who could be happy? He was coming from a life of abundance, and he assumed that to be happy you had to have a palace and you had to have all these worldly goods. So by seeing that, he really started to think deeply, and that was one of his motivations to going outside and seeking the real world and what it was about. And he was 29 when he left the palace, and for 6 years he lived mostly the life of an ascetic, trying to find meaning in life. A lot of people hear about the Buddha, the awakened one, but they don't really realize that for 6 years he was trying to figure it out until he was awakened and enlightened and saw the truth of reality and saw emptiness directly. But all of those things happened after a period of 6 years. And the reason I bring that up is because many times in life, we need our failures in order to go ahead and find our ultimate success. So just as the Buddha had to fail for 6 years before he became awakened, a lot of people, when they're on their journey of going counterculture, going against this culture of let's not talk about death, that's morbid, we should stay away from it, then somehow come to a different place because they see that what they were doing, this fear, this anxiety, this aversion to death, was maybe not the best way to handle it for them or their loved ones. When I was in India, Fred and several congregants went on a trip to India several years ago. It was 2009. And one of the places that we went to was Varanasi. And Varanasi is a city on the Ganges that's famous for burning bodies. It's famous for other things as well, but every day they have hundreds of cremations along the banks of the Ganges. And I'd never seen a cremation before. I'd seen death before, I'd seen bodies before, but I'd never seen cremations. And the most impactful thing about the cremations that I witnessed were that it was so out in the open. Death was a part of their culture, not just conceptually, but literally. When we got off the boat and we walked up to the banks of these funeral pyres that were all lit, it was at night, they had absolutely no discomfort. I was feeling uncomfortable. I felt it was disrespectful to get so close to bodies that were being burned, and yet there was no discomfort on their part because this was a natural process of life. It was you die and something happens to your body, and that's just natural. So again, it made a great impression on me that you could change your view and change your entire experience just by the way you thought about death. And it is interesting. So now we're coming to the talk. One of the things I wanted to share with you before the talk was, we know that this is about death, but we haven't sort of touched on another obsession that we have in our society, which is an obsession with youth. Nobody wants to get old. We go to great pains and spend a lot of money and great effort to not get old. Just look at all the billions of dollars, trillions of dollars spent on beauty aids and this and that in order to keep you from getting old. And then we have, the ultimate luxury, which is plastic surgery. Why do you have plastic surgery? Most of the time it's to look more youthful, to look better, because your physical appearance is tied up in your identity. So when I first started practice in Tampa, there were several physicians that started with me, and one of them was a plastic surgeon. This guy was a very good plastic surgeon, had trained in a very good program, and was technically very proficient. but he had the quintessential surgeon's bedside manner. Just not the kind of guy that you'd want to have coffee with. He was just very gruff and matter of fact, and I'm the greatest, and you need to know that, and that was it. So, he started out, and because he was technically good, he initially got referrals, but you're only as good as usually your reputation in medicine, especially in something like plastic surgery where it's so artistic. So people started to know that he was good, but he turned so many people off because of his attitude. And I remember having dinner with him one night, and he was telling me about this one patient that came in and had a facelift. And he thought the result was absolutely perfect. And she came in after the surgery for her post-op visits, first to 2 weeks, took out the stitches, things like that. And then about a month or maybe 5 weeks after the surgery, when she came in for a follow-up visit, he looked at her and he thought he had done just this incredible job. And she started to talk to him about the fact that she wasn't happy. And that was her motivation, really, to doing the surgery. She wanted to be happy about herself, and yet he had this great result and she wasn't happy. So she keeps talking to him, and he just has absolutely no patience for her. So, and I'll never forget when he told me this. He says, "Come here, I want to show you something." He takes her to his door. He opens the door. He shows her the plaque, and it says, "You see that? It says Dr. Yabba Yabba Yabba." It doesn't say Dr. Happy. It doesn't say, "I'm going to make you happy." So I did exactly what you asked me to do, and now you're not happy. That's not my problem. Now, he didn't do very well in the community because that was part of his job, was to affect her outlook. But I just relate that anecdote because it's, again, this thing of our expectations of what's supposed to happen, what the medical field is supposed to provide for us. And it can be that dramatic. I mean, the talk is not going to be that dramatic, but it was so dramatic when he told me that. I said, that's a lesson. There's really a lesson there. So now we talk about generalizations of Western medicine, the medical model. And we have a system. I'll speak about this country because you can't go all over the West, but we have this medical institution. It's an industry. And by and large, we have these hospitals that are profit centers. So what used to be, quote, a nonprofit where a hospital would do for the community, they called them community hospitals, nonprofit hospitals, that was their purpose, to basically take care of people, not make a profit. The doctors provided the patients, there was an administrator, and he would go ahead and run the hospital. But there weren't shareholders, it wasn't part of a big, publicly held company. It was basically a community that wanted to have the ability to care for its citizens. Well, that pendulum has swung way to the side of this is a business. This is professional business, and make no mistake about it. And doctors are now working for hospitals, etc. So where does that take us? Well, it takes us into a different mind state, because when you come to a hospital, and again, I'm generalizing, I'm not meaning to say that every hospital is this way, but I'm saying our system, by and large, has become an industry. And when you go to that place and you're terminally ill, or you have something that will ultimately do you in, that's the environment. This is not a natural place. This is not a place where people are concerned about the way that you experience it. They do want you to have a good experience, but they want to make a profit at the end of the day. They're not doing charity work, so to speak, as they used to. Now, their charity work is billing Medicare or Medicaid, but it's not writing off what they're doing as a lot of hospitals used to do when they were truly nonprofit. You come in, you didn't have insurance, you needed something, they would take care of you, and somehow, the community would take care of it in some way, shape, or fashion. But that doesn't work like that anymore. So everybody is now compartmentalizing, sub-specializing, as Fred said, and you're basically carved up into a bunch of parts. And if you're on the cardiac care unit, you get this protocol. If you're on some other neurointensive care unit, you're getting some other protocol. But you go to the hospital, and you frequently are taken care of by intensivists, or hospitalists, people who just take care of people in the hospital or in the ICU. And that's it. So your physician hands you off, literally. They don't come to the hospital to make rounds on you anymore. They go ahead and say, okay, you're at the hospital now, you're under the care of this person you've never seen before. They don't know you, you don't know them. Their family doesn't, your family doesn't sort of say, oh, it's this person who really knows my father. I know this. It's not that way. And because of that, things get very, very strange. What you thought was, well, these people are taking care of me, my name is on the door, they'll be coming in to see me. Nurse comes in and she's very focused on her medical records. She comes in with her keyboard and, something that she needs to do, whether it's check your blood pressure, whatever, but most of the time, the nurse now is not engaged in an intimate contact of touching and sort of finding out how you're doing. It's more like, they're going off this protocol of checking off, on the keyboard, okay, that's good, that's good, that's good, that's good. I'll make this notation. But there's almost no eye contact anymore. And again, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but by and large, this is a general sort of overview of how the system has become very, very depersonalized. And you're talking about a very personal situation. You're laying there in a bedrobe. You don't have your clothes on. Half the time, you can't get out of bed to go to the bathroom, so you have to have somebody give you a bedpan. And that very intimate, personal interaction is not there. And you begin to feel it when you go to a hospital now. And now you're then approaching an end-of-life situation. Well, and again, there are many scenarios, but in the interest of the time that I have, I thought I would talk about the hospital as opposed to Marilyn talking later about hospice and palliative care, etc. Because if we had all day to talk about this, we could go through different scenarios, but that's just the way the day has been apportioned. So you don't have this relationship, and this is a very intimate time in your life, where you're thinking about, this is it, all the things that have gotten me to this point in my life are now unfolding, and I'm here, and I'm part of really a process that is not at all personal, and not at all intimate, but much more corporatized, monetized, and it's not a good feeling. So what I want to drive home is that, as Fred said this morning and shared this morning, you need to work on this before you're in that moment, because then it's too late. You've lost control. You don't have that ability to direct the people to behave the way you want them to, because they're following their protocols. So unless you really have a clear understanding, and your loved ones have a clear understanding of how you want this to be at the end of your life, it's not going to happen the way you would like it. And even if you are lucky enough to have planned it, etc., there are things that happen in hospitals that are very disturbing. You can say, I don't want to be resuscitated, I don't want extraordinary means. And in the heat of battle, when somebody who doesn't know you, says, hey, there's a guy in room 14, he's coded, half the time the chart's not there, and it's like, okay, let's do our normal, code procedure, etc. Well, you walk in, you see your relative, and somebody's pounding on their chest, and you say, wait a minute, that's not what they wanted. But that can happen. So what you need to do is proactively not only make sure you have a duck in the row, or your ducks in the row by going through as many of these exercises with your family and loved ones, that this is really what I want. But you also have to have a relationship with these caregivers. Now, there are nurses and their shifts change, but if the loved one, who's the patient, is not able to, you can go down and start to talk to the nurses and say, you know, my father is shared with me how he wants this to go. And you can make sure that there's sort of a relationship that you establish, because when things don't go well and you just get angry, well, guess what happens? That healthcare provider starts to constrict, and they fall back into protocol. Well, I'm sorry, but this is the way we have to do it. As opposed to, yeah, I know you're a reasonable person. We've established this relationship. How can we make this a better experience? That has to be done with a relationship. And people say, well, I'm going to the hospital, I don't have a relationship with these people. But when you start seeing them every day, and you see the shifts, and you see, oh, that's a good nurse. That's not so good. It's because of the way that you connect with them. And you need to start to emotionally connect with these healthcare providers, because they're all you got at the end. They make a lot of important decisions, and they can say, sorry, we're not going to do that. Or, yeah, let's make this as good as we can. So if you come in there, it's like, nope, my father is this or that, and this is the way you're going to do it. Good luck. You're dealing with human beings. And you need to be careful about this relationship that you try to cultivate. You want to emotionally win that team over. You emotionally want to connect to them so that you're a person that they say, I know who that is, as opposed to, that's that family from 202 that is a pain in the butt. And it's important, because in that moment when you don't have the luxury of sort of, getting into a discussion, there are reactions. Very, very fast reactions, and you need to be prepared for that. I wasn't going to get into it, but I'll throw in a little neuroscience, because that's one of the things that I find interesting. But you have in your brain, let's say for the purposes of this discussion, two major systems. You have a conscious system with your prefrontal cortex, which is volitional. You can consciously say, I think I'll do this, or I think I'll do that, and you're responding to situations in a way where you process it. It takes a little longer. Then you have this very old system called the limbic system that is very fast, but it's very reactionary. It's like, there's a center in this limbic system called the amygdala. Well, the amygdala is Greek for almond, because it looks like a little almond. So you have this little almond, and guess what the almond is in charge of? Fear and aggression. Now, first of all, why would anybody design a system and put fear and aggression together in the same spot? Doesn't make sense. It sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? Why would you put fear and aggression together so that they're side by side? Well, when you think about it, it's because often, if you go below fear, if you go below aggression, I should say, you'll find fear. We react aggressively when we're fearful. So it's an actual very efficient way of processing those signals, because they are related. And fear is composed of many things. It's as everything has a composite nature, as we're taught in the Buddhist principles, our emotions are composite. Fear can be a combination or aggression can be, let's say aggression. Aggression can be a combination of fear, frustration, even sadness. They're complex, and they're just the ways that we're processing. I mean, once that moment is over, it's gone, but yet we hold on to it. We hold on to it. And that's what we go on for the rest of the day with. I'll give you another Buddhist story, since we're trying to combine East and West here. But there's a very famous story in Buddhism about these two monks who are walking along this path, and they run into an older woman who's at the bank of a river. And they see that she's not going to make it across. So one of the monks goes ahead and carries her across the river. And when she gets to the other side, he puts her down. And they go off, these two monks. And about half an hour later, one monk goes to the monk that carried the woman and said, you broke your vow, your monastic vow. You're not supposed to touch a woman. You took this strange woman, you touched her, you carried her. What kind of monk are you? So he looked at this other brother monk, and he smiled and he said, I let her down a half an hour ago. You're still carrying her. it's a profound story because we hold on to these thoughts, we hold on to these emotions, but all they are is fleeting. They're created in our mind. They're mind-made. But yet that's the way we spend the rest of the day. For the rest of the day, this guy was, rah, rah, rah. It's over. It's done. And many times, you're in those situations where you just have to let it go. Somebody didn't do what you wanted them to in the hospital. Okay, let it go. What's going to happen now? Are you going to go ahead and make that person an enemy? Are you going to go ahead and beat them over the head and call their superior or supervisor or the doctor and tell them they got to fire this? I mean, that doesn't get you anywhere. You want to win these people over emotionally. Has anybody been in the hospital where they've gotten into a situation? Did it go well?
Well, I was in the hospital for 9 days. I didn't have any family. I was by myself, and I knew exactly that. All the shifts went through for 9 days, so I knew everyone. But you're absolutely right. I needed to make friends with these people. They knew more than I did, of course, it was difficult people. But I also saw people down the hall treating them like servants, and it didn't go very well for them. And so, there's a couple people I had a hard time with, but you're right, you have to kind of reach out to them, even if you're kind of immobile, and just and try to have some compassion too, as well as for yourself, because it's not going to work out if you make them enemies or you treat them like servants. It's just, and some of them are before they're paid too.
Yeah, and again, it's not just you as a patient because you might be more limited, but it's nice to encourage your visitors, your loved ones, the people that can go to the nursing station, sort of establish a rapport. It's nice to get them to understand that that might be as beneficial as they can be in that visit. It's just to make sure that people say, oh yeah, I'd like to go a little further for that family in that room because they're nice people. Another Buddhist principle that I wanted to share, because again, I'm trying to go back and forth between a medical presentation and connect it to Buddhist practice, is what Nancy was addressing, this compassion issue. The litmus test of a good Buddhist practitioner is compassion and understanding combined with wisdom. If you can be compassionate and understanding and do it in a skillful way where you use your wisdom for how to do that, because it's not just good enough to be compassionate, you have to sort of be skillful and wise when you're compassionate. But if you do it from a place of understanding, then it really is of value. And that is one of the greatest things you can take away from the practice of Buddhism. Or if you're not a Buddhist, we don't have the market cornered on compassion, wisdom, and understanding. But to have that in your focus, to put that in your foreground and not in the background, it will be a very, very valuable tool to go through life with. So I encourage everyone, whether they have a practice or not, to be thinking about is this a compassionate way to handle this situation? Am I understanding what this other person from their causes and conditions is doing now? Why are they acting that way? What could explain that? And then maybe they can understand where I'm coming from. Those are very important issues when you have such a sensitive issue as you're in this foreign place, this unnatural place, and someone else has got the controls. They can turn on and off your light. You can't get to it most of the time. They walk into your room, they're going to take your vitals. You can't say, it's not convenient. You're in a system. And unfortunately, in that system, there are financial constraints. A lot of times they're doing tests. And again, it's been shown in some good studies that almost 25% of the tests done in a hospital are not because they're necessary, but they're defensive measures to prevent litigation. So you're getting tests now because someone doesn't want to get sued. So it's like you don't get sued for ordering a test, you get sued for not ordering a test. And in retrospect saying, well, if you would have done that test, everything would have been fine. So you've got all these competing needs here and wants and issues. And here you are, vulnerable as hell. It's a bad mix. So you need to be proactively thinking about this way before you ever cross the threshold of that institution. Are there any questions? I've scared everybody sufficiently, right? Okay, Chip.
The other thing you touched on, I think sometimes forget, those of us who work in hospitals is be mindful of where you are. Even in the hospital. I remember my father being interrupted. He teased with our cousin because he was tending to his mother in the hospital. And my father came to his center and said, "You ought to be interrupted in the office." He said, "No, and it's easy to feel on the pandemic, angry, side, things like that. It's cold and all that. But it helps if we on the other side remember this is where they work. And they like us being for all of them, even though it's going to work for paycheck. We really want to fix your car and we really want to make the person. So you touching on that, and that I think that looking at things where you can really help.
Yeah, just to summarize, the thrust of it was that, again, you're dealing with people with their causes and conditions. This is their job. They're working there. They're trying to do a good job. I don't think that you have people who are trying to be cruel or uncaring, but there's a lot of stress in a hospital. There are a lot of competing interests. The charting, it's like, did you get your charting done? Well, if not, you're going to stay later. So again, these interruptions, all these things, you would say, well, that's their job, but they've got to combine all these things and somehow come up with an 8-hour shift that they can then walk out of, and it becomes very stressful for them. You're dealing with a highly stressed situation. So knowing this allows you to have a perspective that might get you a better result. Yes, Gary?
Yeah, that was really helpful. I was in the hospital recently, and I really saw it, and I hadn't thought about it at all before I went in. I really saw that part of my job was my responsibility to help them reflect me, to feel comfortable with me, and want to spend time with me more than just press with the button. So when I sort of got that, I got that real soon in the sequence. It was it just changed the whole thing. First of all, I got what I wanted more, which I was and the second part is that it just sort of eased the potential for animosity, tension, so it made it less stressful for me at the end of the day. That I had to have a relationship to get around a little bit, but it was my job to do that. It wasn't theirs. That's how I saw it, right or wrong. It was very helpful.
Well, Gary's talking about the power of establishing a relationship, and from his perspective, because he's a practitioner, he felt it was his responsibility to establish the relationship. But I would say, Gary, that the majority of people that come into a hospital feel it's the provider's responsibility to establish a relationship, and most of the time it doesn't go well.
Well, that's ignorant.
Yeah, to a degree it is. Okay, yes, Evelyn?
I think it's important, what Brett said, it starts before that. So Gary's always been working on this before he went into the hospital. This part of compassion, kindness, and understanding. So you start working with him, well, I'm not supposed to hey, right now I'm sitting here. This is where we start. And then it just goes over.
Yeah, it's very important to be proactive about this situation, because when you're deep into it, it's very difficult to process this at your best. And if you haven't shared it with your family or loved ones, and they really don't know, it's probably not going to be an effective way at that last minute to start communicating it. There's going to be too much tension about what do we do? What do we do? So the last thing I wanted to share with you is something that has to do with the physician culture. And this is very important. Physicians are trained, by and large, to treat death as the enemy. Okay? Death is the enemy, and if death prevails, I have failed. Now that's a very deep sort of background to what is in the physician culture. Death is the enemy. I've got to do everything I can to defeat it. If I don't defeat it, I failed, and I'm scared of failing. So if you, as one human being to another, say, wow, you're in a battle and you want to prevail, and if you don't do your job well, you've been defeated by death, you're going to go to great lengths to make sure death doesn't happen on your watch. And as simple as that sounds, very often, in the background, it's implicit, it's not explicit. You don't hear physicians talk like this, but in their culture, death is the enemy. I've got to defeat it. If it prevails, I lose, I failed, I'm not a good physician. As simple and counterintuitive as that sounds, it's the way it is for a lot of physicians. And the assumption is, no, physicians are this objective, body, they know what to do, they've been trained. There's a personal side of being a physician, and there's a persona that you see, but underneath that persona, underneath that mask, there's somebody that has their own issues about death, etc. So be careful about assuming that this is not about someone else's distorted view of what they think is going on, because it's very much alive. And very, very few people have a relationship with their physician where they can sit them down and say, how do you feel about death? What's your orientation here? Because this is the person that might be making the call, as to what to do. And if they're uncomfortable with you dying on their watch for whatever reason, and they start to act accordingly to pursue that, well, where does that leave you? You're a captive audience. So it really is good to if you have that luxury of having a relationship with your physician where you can say, when and if, I'd like you to understand how I feel about it, but I'd also like to understand how you feel about it, because maybe I'm with the wrong physician. Maybe you're great, you're technically proficient, maybe, you're the best guy at getting my numbers perfect, but are you the guy that I want to make these calls with? Maybe that's not the guy. But you don't know that until you start to have a meaningful exchange about what this guy is oriented about when it comes to, I'm not going to let you die on my watch kind of thing. So it's a very important part of understanding that we just take for granted. Oh, my physician, he just does something like it's a black box and everybody does it the same way. A physician is a human being. Some of them are going to say, yeah, share with me what you want, and I can understand that, I can empathize with that. Or, hell, you don't understand. I got a job here to do, and you're not going to die on my watch. It's a very different orientation. But it's good to start to think about that, because most of us don't know our physicians that well. They don't know how they think. They just know that they provide a service. But this is more than providing a service. This is a very intimate relationship at the end of life. Yes, Susan?
Question, Alex. As you said, we don't ordinarily have our same doctor in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of wondering how to to implement what you're talking about. Do I talk to my physician, who, by the way, changes from my insurance changes, and then ask him to intervene for me with the doctor who's not like there in the hospital? How does that work?
It is very problematic. And I don't say that flippantly, but you have to be a little creative. Ideally, if you have a good relationship with your physician can call this person you've been handed off to and say, look, let me tell you, this person I know. They can make that call because they're your physician. Family members might have to develop that communication if you can't, but you certainly can start to try to communicate. But I have to tell you, intensivists have a job. They have an 8-hour shift or a 10-hour shift, and they're there to do a job. And they are intensivists usually because they don't have a strong desire to develop relationships. So it's sort of like, I'm here, I've got my shift, and then my shift is over, I'm going home. So it's very problematic. And if it was easy, I would say, yeah, just do this, this, and this. But it's a tricky, tricky place to navigate. And you have to get a little creative. But it's not one size fits all, I will promise you that. Yes, Joyner.
Following up with Susan, she asked a question that I have an add-on to that. I've already talked to my physician, my wishes, and we're all in agreement and all that. And he has an affiliation with one particular hospital. And so if I had to go to the hospital and there's something really serious, I would go to that hospital. Are you saying that he cannot help coordinate the care if it gets assigned to somebody else even though he is affiliated?
I would ask your physician what his relationship is with the hospital. Some doctors, they see their patients, admit them. Some doctors don't even have admitting privileges at a hospital. And okay, so if he has admitting privileges and you say, look, this is a concern of mine, how will this happen? How will this unfold? How will this manifest if I have to go to the hospital because of some serious illness? He could say, well, I'm going to be there with you, which is great, because some doctors do go to the hospital with their patients. But again, you just have to find out on a very individual basis. Yeah, I would say, do it prospectively. Yes, Diane.
This is just an observation from a family member's perspective. When my mother was in the hospital, and she was there for about 2 days and then died, and she had been very matter of fact about being ready to die and not wanting any extraordinary measures taken. And she had a living will and advance directives, and I brought copies of those to give to them. But what I found very interesting was that her do not resuscitate order did not come, and so it wasn't there with her. So I felt the need to tell everybody who came in, the nurses, the doctors, that these documents were in her file, that she did have a do not resuscitate order, even though it wasn't right there. And what was interesting was how difficult that was for me to do. Even though I knew my mother wanted me to do that, and that I needed to do that, I felt that I was asking them to let her die, and that, part of me was thinking, oh, they probably think I want her to die. So I think that's just something to be prepared for, which I was not prepared for.
Yes, Diana.
Just to put in a plug for hospital chaplains, because chaplains, I think, are actually required to make the patient's needs known to the physician. So even to the family, and so many of us are used to chaplains being possibly, Christian chaplains, but regardless of their basic faith, and that's part of their job. So if a family member even knows for sure that that person would not want any special measures, they can at least put in a plug for that and make sure that time is taken. I know apparently some physicians kind of consider chaplains to be at the lowest rung in the hospital setting, but it still can kind of plant that seed and certainly get sort of comfort for the family to help that process.
Yeah, well, that's a very good point, and just for the purposes of the recording, the question had, well, not a question, but the comment had to do with the value or the potential value of the chaplain in a hospital, and that's a resource that you can certainly access. So, yes, I think that's good. That's all good. Yes?
I think we're talking about having reasonable expectations when you brought up the surgeon originally. I think it's probably a good idea to have reasonable expectations about a surgeon and not expect him to be the psychiatrist or her, and not expect him to be what he or she is not. And there's an old story about, or actual story I knew of, two people going out playing golf, the surgeon and the psychiatrist said to the surgeon, "You're such a nice guy, Jack. You're not like that in the hospital, because I have to open up the throat and chest of somebody every single day. It's not my job to be one pleasant, that's yours." And I think we as patients, if we have good surgeons, don't expect them to be also psychiatrists and all the rest. We might find it easier.
Okay. The comment was about expectations for a surgeon being all things to all people. And yes, this is a human being that has a certain orientation. That's why they became a surgeon. So it's like everything else, there's a spectrum. where does it tilt? It would be nice to have all things wrapped up in one, but it doesn't work like that. And you'll have to make the decision as to whether you want a technician that's proficient or somebody that makes you feel that they're with you. And hopefully someday you can find somebody that strikes that balance, the golden mean, as Aristotle would say. Yes?
So I work at a VA hospital, and people will come in with advanced directives, but the thing that speaks the loudest is whether the hospitalist put in a do not resuscitate order. And the last time I inquired, my understanding was it has to happen at every admission. Even if the veteran had that DNR in the last time, they must ask for it again. So there's a CYA going on for all the doctors and nurses, and they really want to know if that's in there or not. And they'll ask, and they want to know if they're following, what that person wants. But if it's not in there, then they're not free to do it. They have to do it bring it back because they don't want to get sued. So I don't know if that's true in all hospitals, but talking to the hospitalist right off the top and saying, would you put in a DNR, I think it's a good way to go. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, because again, you're talking about the tremendous fear of litigation.
Right.
And everybody wants to make sure they're covered. So you dot the I's, you cross the T's. Every time you come in, you have to make sure that you've gone ahead and gone through that process. Just like if you signed a contract and it changes, you have to have it re-witnessed and re-notarized.
And underneath that, I do believe there's a genuine desire to do what the family and the person wants. So if it hasn't been explicitly stated, people feel uncomfortable letting somebody go. Because they want to do it with the person.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. And again, I'm talking in generalizations. I'm not saying everybody does this, but if you are aware of it, it's nice to err on the side of, making it explicit as opposed to assuming that that's the way they're going to go ahead and take it. If there are no other questions, I was going to just go back to an anecdotal story that has to do with my experience with chronic illness and the Grim Reaper in the background. But my oldest sister is suffering from some chronic diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, a chronic pulmonary condition. She's in her 70s, and she's in the system. She's up in New York. She goes to NYU. She's, going to a tertiary care facility, has all the bells and whistles, super specialists here or there. One guy will say this, and then she'll go to another guy, and she feels like she's in this maze. And she's really very fearful of death. And I tried to speak with her about it, and she really has gotten to the point where she'll ask me, say, I really appreciate what you're trying to do, but I really feel so uncomfortable when you talk about death, that she's so fearful that she doesn't even want to hear something being talked about that is so painful for her. So I say this to you to encourage everyone to understand that you're still dealing with a very intimate, relationship. And even though you might say, oh, you gotta talk about this, it's good for you, it's the way it should be, let's talk about death and dying. Some people just are not ready to have that conversation, and it's a very difficult conversation for most, but for some, it's off the charts. So I just encourage you, if you come out of this workshop, or symposium, whatever you want to call it, and feel like, okay, this is really the right thing, I want to help my loved one, so they better go ahead and get on the stick. It might be that they're not there yet, and you just have to be mindful of that.